Hello everyone, Sandra here, and welcome to another episode of Thinking About Game Design. I've recently played through Elden Ring, and I have a couple of ideas for these videos that I want to make, and this is the first one. And today I want to talk about a very interesting experience I had. This is kind of a gut feeling, as I was playing through the game, that there wasn't very much enemy diversity. And I was wondering, where did this gut feeling come from? Because as I thought about it, it doesn't make any sense. There's quite a wide variety of enemy diversity in Elden Ring, but I felt like there wasn't as much as there is. And I spent a good bit of time trying to puzzle out why this was. And I think this is something that's really interesting to examine, and it's something that I'm going to call enemy distribution. This is an effect where the way that you've distributed enemies throughout the game kind of creates a certain feeling or experience, and how that impacts the sort of sense of differences in experience. So this is one of those things that's a little hard to describe in and of itself, so I think it's better to use an example. And I think Dark Souls 1 is actually a really good example of good enemy distribution. And what enemy distribution is about creating different experiences for different zones to help differentiate different areas. So, for example, in Dark Souls 1, the Dark Root Garden has these plant enemies that have a specific set of moves where they've got these longer branches, vine things that they whip at you, and they have a kind of a grab move. So you have to be a little bit careful getting too close to them. And there's also the Giant Stone Knights that are pretty resistant to damage and have good poise, but not much health, but decent reach because they're large. So it's like there's a couple of specific enemies that you're going to encounter in this area that characterize that area. Sen's Fortress having mostly like in the body of the place the two types of man serpents, the ones with the big, the man serpent greatsword, and then the ones with the flamberges that shoot the lightning magic at you, and that creates a distinct experience for that area. The skeletons in the catacombs and the graveyard just immediately preceding it don't show up anywhere else that I can think of offhand. Bone wheels are only in a couple of specific areas, the bottom of the catacombs and that one in the well area in the Painted World of Ariamis. Even your basic hollows are that you think of, as I've been trying to think about it, like, where do they show up? It's like the upper and lower Undead Burg. They're not in Blighttown. They're in the depths, earlier parts of the depths, and in various parts of the depths. They're in the Asylum, of course, but like, and in the Painted World as well, of course. But you get to Anor Londo, they're not there. They're not in Sen's Fortress. They're not in Blighttown. Blighttown has its own set of enemies. So it's like there's a bunch of different places where these guys aren't showing up. And so if you look at the overall enemy distribution, where enemies are and what enemies are in what places in Dark Souls 1, each zone tends to be characterized by a specific set of enemies that have specific move sets and specific ways that you need to approach them. The way that you approach Silver Knights in Anor Londo is different than the way that you're going to be approaching your regular shield hollows. With the sword and spear shield hollows, or sword and shield, spear and shield and sword and shield hollows in the Burg, for example, or even just the ones with torches. Like you're going to approach torch hollows a bit differently because they are terrifying. So it's just something that got me thinking. Like, this is an example of enemy distribution where you go to a zone and it feels different from other places. The way that you're fighting enemies is different. That combat experience differs. And as I think about Elden Ring, enemies tend to be more broadly distributed. You've got the different tiers of military, where you have like the foot soldiers, the soldiers with like crossbows, often, and then the knights, right? You have those three different tiers. And that is across like 5 or 6 different military units. Like you have Godric, Radon, the Cuckoo ones. I don't know if they're separate carrion ones or not. That one's a little confused for me. But the Lendel, the Halig, and I've probably forgotten one, quite frankly. There's a bunch of different ones, and they're all similar. They're not the same. And this is one of those things that's really important here. It is not about the details. Like, within Elden Ring, I think any given zone generally has pretty reasonable enemy distributions, like different enemies and stuff showing up, and things are interesting that way. But it's a holistic picture. It's not when you zoom in, it's when you zoom out. And the experience of fighting knights in one group of knights is not super different from fighting another group of knights. Sometimes they have thrown projectiles, such as fire bombs or lightning bombs, or the cuckoo glintstones. Sometimes they have great bows that the knights use. Some units within these military units use a great shield and spear. Others use like a sword and shield, or sword and torch, or a great sword. So there's some variation within them, but those variations tend to be somewhat the same across the different military units. And so like the experience of fighting one military unit is not drastically different from fighting another one. And like they're fine encounters. There's no like I like them. But when you like zoom out holistically, there's a lot of fighting that type of enemy, right? And like the marionettes are another really good example. They're in quite a few different places in the game, so you're fighting them a lot. The misbegotten, the demi-humans. These are groups that you're running across quite frequently. Those who live in death show up in graveyards all over the world. And so it's this sort of experience where any given spot is fine, but holistically, I'm not getting enough difference in the feeling of fighting enemies from one place to another. Even if they're overlapping on like 50% of the enemies or 60% of the enemies, that's 60% overlap, right? And even if different zones are overlapping in different ways, that still is kind of creating this sort of gradient. There's not the sharp contrast of encounters that you get with like Dark Souls 1, where you go through a door and suddenly you're fighting these mushroom men in the forest, or where I should have maybe prepared examples ahead of time, but that's not how I roll. Where you go down from the depths and there's these giant rats, and then you go down into Blighttown, you have the large guys with clubs and a different set of a different type of hollow that has a different weapon set and jumps at you, and these sorts of things, where it's very clear, like when you think of Blighttown and Blighttown enemies, you're not thinking of the same set of enemies when you're thinking of the upper undead burg, or when you think of Anor Londo, right? The enemy sets don't have much, if any, overlap, and that really helps differentiate things. There are some areas in Elden Ring that do a good job of having individual like enemies characterize them. The Volcano Manor with its man serpents there, it's variation on that theme, that idea that FromSoft has done quite a number of times. That's one spot that immediately comes to mind. The monstrous dogs and birds of Caelid they show up in a few other places, but not in anywhere near the numbers that they do in Caelid, and that kind of stands out as an enemy that very much so characterizes Caelid. So there's some spots where that is very much the case. Sorcerers being mainly in Celia and Rhea Lucaria is another example that comes to mind. So it's like Elden Ring does have that stuff going on. It's just a big picture thing. To pull on another metaphor for my fellow Guild Wars 1 fans, when you look at Kaineng City, this is another thing that's been running through my head, so I kind of want to get it out there, you know? Kaineng City is a large city. There's like, I don't know, 7-ish explorable zones, give or take, that all take place there, and each one is different. Shenzhen Tunnels is different from like Tanakai Temple's greater explorable area. And that's different from Bukdek Byway and Wajan Bazaar, the Shikuang Skyway, however you're supposed to pronounce that properly, the Undercity. Like all of these parts of Kaineng City are different when you look at the details. But when you zoom out to a big holistic picture, it feels like you spend a lot of time in the same place. And there's just so much similarity. And it is, again, that holistic view. So my big takeaway, my big lesson from this whole thing that I've been discussing, and hopefully I've communicated what I was experiencing and what I realized I was experiencing. But my big takeaway from this as a game designer is that if I want to make a region feel unique and distinct, one of the things that's important to look at is how are combat encounters, how is the common activity that you're doing in this area, how does that feel unique and distinct and different? How does that make the player approach it differently? Consider the challenges differently. what sort of things are they going to have to deal with? Because, again, going back to Dark Souls 1, because it just does such a beautiful job at this, when I'm in Darkroot Forest, how am I managing, like, if I stay away from the enemies, they're whipping me. If I get too close, they can get through my guard with their grab attack. How am I wanting to approach these enemies? If I'm going to the Man Serpent area in Sen's Fortress, what am I doing about those guys and their particular larger attacks and things like that? How am I managing Silver Knights, and particularly like Spear Silver Knights with a really good guard and things like that? And so there's just different strategies that are good in different areas, and that creates a different experience and helps characterize that area and sort of embed its essence and feel. And I feel like this is an area where Elden Ring is a bit weaker, and that is why I ended up feeling that there wasn't as much enemy diversity as there is, just because the enemy distribution kind of disguised it. So that's something that for me is a big takeaway. Diversity of enemies is something that comes from being very conscious about where they show up and how, and enemy distribution is really important and influences the experience and overall impression of a game a lot. So thank you all very much for listening, for watching this video, and until next time, everyone, take care and goodbye.